For decades, Robert Tilton stood in front of television cameras, pointed his finger at the screen, and told millions of desperate people that God was speaking directly through him. He told them that poverty was a punishment, that sickness was tied to weak faith, and that the only path to a breakthrough was a financial seed planted inside his ministry. People who could barely cover their monthly bills mailed in their last $100. Elderly women sent in their wedding rings. Sick and frightened people handed over savings they had spent entire lifetimes building, convinced that a miracle was waiting on the other side of their sacrifice. And now, after decades of controversy, mounting legal battles, and a series of events that finally caught up with him, Robert Tilton is facing a sentence that his most loyal supporters never believed would come. The man who once controlled a television ministry generating over $80 million a year is no longer standing in the spotlight he spent decades constructing. This is not just another chapter in a long and troubled story. For Robert Tilton, this may finally be the last one. To understand how he arrived at this moment, you have to go back to where it all started, to a time when there were no cameras, no television deals, and no empire. In 1976, Tilton walked into a rundown YMCA building in Farmers Branch, Texas, with his family at his side and almost nothing in his hands. $10 and a gas credit card. That was the full extent of what he owned. The building carried the smell of old gym shoes, the crowd was small, and nothing about the setting suggested that anything significant was about to begin. But Tilton carried something that could not be measured in dollar amounts. He had a voice, a commanding presence, and a sharp instinct for understanding exactly what struggling people needed to hear. His church, the Word of Faith Family Church, opened with a budget of just $27,000 in 1976. Within a year, that number climbed to $250,000. The year after, it nearly tripled to $750,000. By 1980, the annual intake had reached $1.8 million. In less than 5 years, the man who arrived with $10 was overseeing a rapidly expanding operation that was already beginning to look far more like a corporation than a neighborhood church. But the moment that would define everything had not yet arrived. That came in 1981. When Tilton traveled to Hawaii and watched something on late-night television that would permanently alter the direction of his ministry and set in motion the chain of events that eventually led him to where he stands today. What Robert Tilton watched that night in Hawaii were late-night infomercials hosted by real estate promoter Dave Delgado. The programs were slickly produced, emotionally crafted, and built around a simple psychological formula. They showed images of luxury, featured testimonials from ordinary people who claimed their lives had been transformed, and delivered one repeating message: wealth was not reserved for the privileged few. It was available to anyone willing to take one simple step. Tilton did not watch those programs as a casual viewer. He watched them as a student. He studied the pacing, the emotional language, and the way testimonials were arranged to build trust before the ask arrived. And somewhere in those late-night hours, a realization took shape inside him. The same formula that was selling real estate dreams to television audiences could be rebuilt around faith. Instead of promising financial freedom through property investment, he could promise it through God. Instead of success stories tied to business deals, he could feature miracles, healings, unexpected money arriving in the mail, and lives turned completely around by a single act of faithful giving. The product would be different, but the architecture underneath would be identical. He returned to Dallas with a vision and secured a $1.3 million loan from a local banker. That money went directly into transforming his local television program. Better cameras were installed. Lighting was redesigned. Sets were cleaned up and polished. Graphics were updated. The modest local broadcast that had been quietly running on Dallas stations was rebuilt from the ground up and relaunched as Success in Life, a daily 1-hour religious program engineered to function exactly like a television infomercial. The message it delivered was consistent and precise. Poverty was a curse connected to wrong beliefs and disobedience. Faith was the cure. And the measure of faith was financial. Tilton frequently pushed $1,000 as the amount that demonstrated serious commitment, framing it not as a donation but as a vow, a sacred financial promise made directly to God. For viewers who were already struggling, who were desperate for any reason to believe their circumstances could change, that language carried enormous weight. It created a framework where giving felt less like a choice and more like a test. Refuse, and you were refusing God.
give, and a breakthrough would be coming.
By the late 1980s, Success and Life had expanded across all 235 American television markets.
In many cities, it aired every single day.
The ministry was receiving approximately 220,000 letters every month. At its peak in 1991, the operation was generating around $80 million annually.
But hidden behind those staggering numbers, something far darker was quietly building. The letters that poured into Tilton's ministry every month were not simply pieces of mail.
They were something far more personal than that. People wrote about cancer diagnoses they had just received and did not know how to face. They wrote about marriages falling apart, about children lost to addiction, about debts so crushing they could no longer sleep at night. Some of them tucked cash inside the envelopes because they had no checks to write.
Others went further, sending jewelry, wedding rings, and family heirlooms they had held onto for decades, believing that the sacrifice of something deeply meaningful could help unlock the miracle they were praying for.
And Tilton had made them a promise. He told viewers directly, on camera, in front of his entire television audience, that he would personally pray over every single request that arrived. That promise was the foundation of the emotional bond between him and the people sending those letters.
It was not just about money.
It was about trust, about the belief that someone powerful and connected to God was holding their pain in his hands and interceding on their behalf.
The reality behind that promise was something else entirely. The letters were being routed through a mail processing company in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
When they arrived, the first step in the process was not prayer.
It was extraction. The money and checks were removed.
The prayer requests were separated from the donations. And then, in what would later become the most damaging single detail to emerge from any investigation into Tilton's operation, the prayer requests were discarded. The personal letters, the handwritten confessions of fear and grief and desperation, the wedding rings and heirlooms sent as acts of faith, were being thrown away after the money was taken out. The people who wrote those letters believed they were being heard.
They were not.
What made the eventual exposure of this practice so powerful was not just the act itself, but the way it was uncovered. The man responsible for cracking open Tilton's operation was not a famous journalist working for a major network. He was Ole Anthony, the president of the Trinity Foundation in Dallas, a small and largely unknown watchdog organization that spent its time investigating religious fraud and the hidden practices of powerful televangelists. Anthony received a tip suggesting that Tilton's ministry was discarding the letters it claimed to pray over.
Most people would have picked up the phone and called a reporter. Anthony did something different.
He drove to Tulsa, and he started going through the trash outside the mail processing facilities connected to Tilton's operation. What he found there would change everything.
People laughed at Ole Anthony and his volunteers.
They called them garbologists and dumpster divers and treated the entire operation as something between a joke and a nuisance.
Anthony did not respond to the mockery. He kept going back.
Over the course of roughly 30 days, he and his team made 14 separate trips to the trash outside facilities connected to Tilton's ministry. What they pulled out of those dumpsters was not ordinary office waste. It was tens of thousands of prayer request letters, many of them written in shaking handwriting by people who were sick, frightened, and completely out of options. Mixed among the letters were bank statements, internal mailing manuals, computer printouts, donor coding systems, and operational documents that revealed in precise detail exactly how the ministry managed and targeted its donor base. The picture that emerged from that trash was methodical, calculated, and deeply disturbing. Donors were divided into categories. Their giving patterns were tracked. Their responses were monitored. The warm and personal letters many of them received back from the ministry, letters that sounded as though Tilton himself had sat down and written them specifically for the reader, had actually been crafted by a direct mail specialist named Gene Ewing, engineered to feel intimate while being sent to massive numbers of people simultaneously. When this evidence reached the public, the consequences arrived quickly. In 1992 and 1993, multiple donors filed fraud lawsuits against Tilton. Among them was Vivian Elliott, who had donated money toward a family crisis center that Tilton's ministry had promoted extensively on television. In 1994, Elliott won a $1.5 million judgment after evidence showed that the crisis center had never been built and, more troublingly, appeared to have never been genuinely intended for construction at all.
It looked like a turning point. But the judgment was later overturned on appeal, and Tilton walked away from what had seemed like a definitive legal defeat. Rather than quietly stepping back from public life, Tilton responded to the lawsuits by going on offense. He sued Ole Anthony, along with attorneys who were representing plaintiffs in the fraud cases against him. Critics immediately labeled it a slap lawsuit, a strategic legal action designed not to win in court but to financially exhaust and intimidate the people challenging him. Tilton argued that those he sued had conspired against him and violated his constitutional rights. The federal court did not agree. The case was dismissed. He appealed. The appeal failed. And for the first time in his career, Robert Tilton found himself standing in the wreckage of something he could not rebuild, negotiate away, or outrun with another television program. By 1996, the ministry that had once filled a church with 8,000 members had collapsed to fewer than 300. The Word of Faith Family Church, the organization Tilton had built from a $27,000 budget inside a worn-out YMCA, was formally dissolved. He preached his final sermon there on March 16, 1996, handed leadership to another minister, and left Dallas behind. The empire was gone. The television presence had evaporated. The staff of 850 people who had once kept the operation running had scattered. The $40 million in real estate holdings were no longer his. The man who had promised millions that God would reward their sacrifice was now starting over with almost nothing. He moved to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and in 1997 returned to television with a rebuilt version of Success and Life. The strategy was different this time. Rather than chasing the broad national audience he had once commanded, he purchased airtime on independent stations reaching inner-city communities. In 1998, the program began airing on Black entertainment television, joining BET's late-night religious programming block. By 2008, it occupied the first hour of that block regularly. The message had not changed. The vows of faith were back. The financial seed language returned. The same framework that had driven the original ministry was being quietly rebuilt for a new audience, in a new city, with a lower profile but an identical engine running underneath. And yet the legal consequences that had been building across decades did not disappear simply because he changed markets and relocated to Florida. The sentencing that his most loyal supporters refused to believe would ever come has now arrived. The process that exposed the discarded prayer letters, the ghost-written correspondence, the donor tracking systems, and the crisis center that was never built has finally reached its conclusion. Every legal challenge he filed, every appeal he launched, and every attempt to reframe the narrative around his own victimhood has run its course. What remains is a final judgment that no television program, no new ministry name, and no carefully worded statement can reverse or erase. Robert Tilton arrived in Farmers Branch with $10 and an instinct for what desperate people needed to hear. He built something enormous on the back of that instinct, then used it to take from the very people who trusted him most. They sent their last dollars, their wedding rings, and their deepest pain because he told them God was listening. The sentence that arrived this week says something different. It says the taking is over. It says the camera is finally off. And for the man who always had another move waiting, there is nothing left except goodbye.